HMS Glatton was a coastal defense battleship originally built for the Norwegian Navy in 1912 under the name Bjørgvin, the Old Norse name for the port city of Bergen. Like several vessels being constructed in the United Kingdom during the 1910s, she and her sister ship Nidaros were taken into Royal Navy service at the behest of the First Lord of the Admiralty, Winston Churchill, with plans for the Norwegian government to receive payments for the ships. The ships had just been launched when they were taken over by the Royal Navy, and there were some changes the Admiralty wanted to make. And because other ships took priority, it meant that Glatton and Gorgon were not ready for service until the summer of 1918, where Glatton arrived at Dover on September 11th, 1918, to prepare for the big summer offensive planned for later that month, where at around 6:30 p.m. on the 16th, a large explosion was heard and a great plume of smoke was observed by Admiral Roger Keyes, commander of the Dover Patrol, and upon further investigation, he found Glatton burning fiercely. Keyes and his friend, the captain of Glatton, fought furiously to try to prevent the burning ship from spreading further, and eventually she had to be sunk by torpedoes at 8:15 p.m. Out of a crew of 346, one officer and 59 men were missing, and a further 124 were injured, 19 of whom died later from their burns. Under a year later, a court of Enquiry ruled that the slow combustion of the cork lagging of the 6-inch midships magazine of the Glatton led to the ignition of the magazine and then the ignition of the cordite in it, and so caused the explosion. Although there are other explanations we will look into. In 1912, the newly independent Norwegian government envisaged a large naval expansion to protect its coastal waters, having a rather long coast, filled with fjords and inlets, which included other vessels to add to their existing fleet of 4 coastal defense ships, along with destroyers and submarines. In January 1913, the plan for the coastal defense battleships was entrusted to the British firm Armstrong Whitworth, which had built 2 vessels for them already, and these 2 new ones were to be delivered to the Norwegian Navy in 2 years. The dimensions of the hull were restricted to the only dry dock the Norwegian Navy had access to at the Horten Naval Dockyard near Oslo. This meant that the 2 ships were rather small, only displacing 4,807 tons as designed, and were armed with 2 240mm or 9.45-inch 50 caliber guns and single turrets. Also mounted in single turrets were 4 150mm or 5.9-inch 50 caliber guns, 6 100mm 3.9-inch guns, and 2 submerged torpedo tubes completed the powerful armament of these small coastal defense battleships. The ships were also well protected with a 7-inch belt and 2-inch protective deck that ran the length of the hull. The machinery was also modest and provided for a 15-knot top speed. With such a small ship, it was tough to fit all the machinery and magazines into these ships, where Big Gun Monitors, Design, Construction, and Operations 1919 to 1945 by Ian Buxton has this to say. The only place for the midship 150mm magazine was sandwiched between the engine and boiler rooms, an arrangement used in British battleships, although in conjunction with insulating airspaces. Keep this in mind as it will be important later on. The 2 ships were named after 2 major Norwegian cities, Bergen and Trondheim in Old Norse. Both ships were launched in the summer of 1914, with Glatton launched on August 8th, shortly after the Great War had broken out. In November 1914, First Lord of the Admiralty Winston Churchill and First Sea Lord of the Admiralty Jackie Fisher appreciated the fact that these 2 vessels, with their capabilities as coastal defense battleships, could be appropriated for coastal bombardment, something on the mind of these 2 men, with the bombardment of the Dardanelles going on in the future Gallipoli campaign and the opportunities on the French and Belgian coasts, not to mention the creation of the 14-inch monitors and 12-inch monitors. So, arrangements with the Norwegian government were made for Norway to transfer the 2 ships to Britain and for Britain to refund the installments already paid, totaling some £740,000 for the 2 ships. On January 9, 1915, orders went to Armstrong to complete the 2 ships for the Royal Navy at the earliest possible date. Changes needed to be made to meet the standards of the Royal Navy. The guns were rebored to 9.2 inches and 6 inches respectively, enabling existing service ammunition to be used. 12 double-bottom tanks were modified to carry oil fuel to increase endurance, and the boilers were converted to coal/oil firing. In early spring 1915, the ships were renamed Gorgon and Glatton respectively. This work was estimated to take 10 to 12 months, although the work was suspended by the Admiralty to allow faster progress to be made on Admiral Fisher's pet project, the large light cruisers, namely Furious and Courageous. In September 1917, orders were sent to Armstrong to complete the ships to newly revised designs. Anti-torpedo bulges were to be fitted, covering 75% of the hull length, which will be important later on, and this necessitating the removal of the torpedo tubes, along with further changes to the guns, a tripod mast abaft the funnel, and of course, an increased displacement with all this new weight and a reduced top speed. The result of all these changes was the fact that these coastal defense battleships were now monitors, each with two very powerful 9.2-inch guns and a secondary battery that was nothing to sneeze at. These two ships could be a useful reinforcement to the monitor force that was operating off the Belgian coast, attacking German positions. The modifications did, of course, take time to complete, and it was not until August 31st, 1918, was Glatton commissioned at Newcastle under Commander Nestor Diggle, a friend of Admiral Roger Keyes of the Dover Patrol. Gorgon had been commissioned in May and had arrived at the Dover Patrol on June 6, 1918, where she spent the next few weeks working up and then began working with the 12-inch and 15-inch monitors to attack German positions near the coast. Meanwhile, Glatton arrived at Dover on September 11, 1918, where she and her crew of a little under 350 men started preparing for the big offensive plan for later that month. Glatton was in the harbor at Dover on the night of September the 16th, when the two friends, Keyes and Diggle, were taking a walk after tea, where I think monitors of the Royal Navy, How the Fleet Brought the Great Guns to Bear by Jim Crossley describes the scene best. Admiral Roger Keyes, commanding the Dover Patrol, had been glad when his friend Commander Nestor Diggle arrived at Dover with his new ship Glatton, in time to join the bombardment of the Belgian coast. The Admiral invited his friend for tea with his family, and they were walking the cliffs together when a terrific explosion shook Dover, and a black mushroom cloud erupted from somewhere near the harbor. The two men rushed back to the Admiral's house, where they were informed by telephone that Glatton had experienced a magazine explosion in one of her magazines and was on fire. Jumping into the Admiral's wife's old Ford, they were driven at breakneck speed to the harbor to find an operation already in hand to evacuate many burned people from Glatton and tugs alongside pumping water into the fire. If the explosion and fire weren't bad enough, the ammunition ship Granshaw lay in the next berth 150 yards away, where it had enough ammunition aboard to devastate all of Dover. As they arrived, they could see huge yellow flames from Glatton's midship 6-inch magazine that continued to shoot up through the roof of Q turret, starboard midships, and reach the masthead among the clouds of white smoke. The smoke turned to black as the fire reached the oil and coal bunkers surrounding the magazine and boiler rooms, and then began to spread aft. Diggle's officer corps had been devastated by the explosion and fire, where he found only one surviving officer aboard, a junior surgeon who was busy tending to the men, but a petty officer who was on shore leave came aboard and joined Captain Diggle. Diggle and Keyes had clambered aboard Glatton's forecastle to find the casualties had been heavy in the mess deck areas and officers' quarters directly above the seat of the fire. The after part of the ship was completely cut off by the flames, so they could not organize effective rescue operations in that area. The petty officer and Diggle went on a desperate search for the seacocks and the flooding keys for the magazines. They managed to flood the forward part of the ship, but the after part could not be reached through the still raging fire, and it was only a question of time before the aft magazine blew up, probably taking Granshaw and most of Dover with it. The terrible situation was made worse, as there was many men below crying out for help, and seamen from nearby ships swarmed aboard to try to save them. After about 45 terrible minutes, the cries from below ceased as Admiral Roger Keyes ordered the ship abandoned, as he was going to sink her one way or another to prevent the destruction of Dover. Keyes reluctantly decided that his only course of action was to sink Glatton by torpedo. So boarding the nearest destroyer, Cossack, not that one, which had just arrived from Hull. Cossack's first 18-inch torpedo hit the bulge amidships, but embedded itself in the plating without exploding, as it had not traveled enough distance to run off its safety device. At 7:40, Cossack's second and last torpedo was more successful, punching a hole in Glatton's starboard side, but the 200-pound explosive was not enough to defeat the torpedo bulge that was installed, and Glatton remained afloat, still burning furiously. Keyes then transferred to the destroyer Mings and ordered her captain to torpedo Glatton. Two 21-inch torpedoes were fired from close range into the existing hole in Glatton's side, and at 8:15, under a barrage of torpedoes, she heeled over slowly to starboard until she came to rest at 148 degrees over the vertical, with her masts and superstructure resting on the bottom and part of her port bulge showing above the water. The fire was quickly extinguished, and the danger of further and far more dangerous explosions was averted, thanks to the heroic efforts of the men of the destroyers, tugs, Glatton, and those on shore. They ensured that Dover remained intact and not a crater. Casualties for Glatton were heavy, involving over half the crew of 346. One officer and 59 men were missing, and a further 124 were injured, with 19 unfortunate souls dying from their burns. With the recent loss of HMS Vanguard and Scapa Flow due to a possible Cordite explosion, and the losses of the battlecruisers Indefatigable, Queen Mary, and Invincible at Jutland 2 years ago, a court of inquiry was set up immediately to determine the cause of the explosion. It was established that the fire had started in the 6-inch magazine amidships. In the plans for the ships that I had mentioned at the beginning of the video, this was sited in the hole between the boiler rooms and engine rooms and flanked by the 6-inch shell rooms. Like in my video on the loss of Vanguard, there were several theories for the cause of the explosions, with sabotage, spontaneous ignition of the Cordite, maloperation of the oil fuel and coal bunkers, and overheating of the magazines were all examined. These all are very interesting ideas, where Buxton explains things better than I could. There was no reason why that last one should have occurred, as not only had insulation been provided all around the magazine, but special cooling equipment was installed. Sabotage was often suspected during wartime, but it was soon ruled out, particularly as the ship had not been in contact with the shore since leaving Newcastle a week earlier. Spontaneous ignition of the Cordite was also unlikely, as tests on other charges from the same batch showed that it had not deteriorated significantly in storage. The stokers were in the habit of piling red-hot ashes and clinker from the boilers against the magazine bulkhead before periodically clearing them up the ash ejector into the starboard after corner of the boiler room. The stoker petty officer thought that the engine room was on the other side of the bulkhead and that there was no danger in the practice. Promising for the investigators, as it could be a possible explanation for the cause of the explosion. So, going to Glatton's sister ship Gorgon, they closely conducted an experiment to see if this was the cause of the explosion. They examined Gorgon at Dover. Issues with the 6-inch ammunition and insulation of the midship 6-inch magazine were noted. The bulkhead construction, including cork and wood paneling, showed that blistering of red lead paint reached temperatures of at least 400 degrees Celsius. Trials were conducted by deliberately piling red-hot ashes against the bulkhead, but results were inconclusive, with temperatures not high enough to ignite the cork or wood. The possibility of oil seeping into the lagging was considered. Tests showed that cork could release flammable gases in the presence of high temperatures and air under pressure. Despite various trials, no conclusive evidence emerged by 1919. Eventually, in the April of 1919, the Court of Inquiry gave its verdict concluding that the slow combustion of the cork lagging of the 6-inch magazine of the Glatton led to the ignition of the magazine and then to the ignition of the Cordite in it and so caused the explosion. When shown the findings, both Engineer-in-Chief Vice Admiral Godwin and the Director of Naval Construction Eustace Tennyson Danecourt did not accept that the cork had burnt. Nevertheless, insulation on Gorgon was replaced by silicate cotton to be on the safe side, and as this was going on, a more likely cause was revealed. Behind some of the wood paneling was not granulated cork, but empty spaces and folded newspaper, causing further investigations of the bulkhead, which showed the existence of half-inch diameter holes in the plating where rivets had been omitted. These two discoveries pointed to a very likely cause of the fire, although no conclusions had been drawn. The ashes could have raised the temperature sufficiently to have ignited the newspaper, which may have been present in Glatton also, with air supplied through the forced draft pressure in the boiler room through the open rivet holes, and the cork under these conditions would have given off flammable gases, charred the wood paneling, and eventually ignited the cordite charges. This is speculation, as the true cause will never be known, since the ship was destroyed. Salvage work proved difficult, as Glatton was lying at an awkward angle. Work would not begin until May 1925, and through the use of tugs and cranes, Glatton was refloated and moved alongside the western pier of the submarine harbor in March of 1926, where her hulk is now buried under land reclaimed for the present car ferry terminal. The true cause of the fire and subsequent explosion will likely never be known, although in my research, I can't help but think about all the issues with cordite the Royal Navy had during the First World War, and the Russian Navy for that matter, with my recent video on the Empress Maria, and especially the loss of Vanguard, because they seem very similar. Anyway, let me know what you all think, and until next time, my friends, have a great week. Thanks for watching once again.